Sometimes a game doesn't need a compelling story or a huge range of mechanics to be really good, and trying to do too much can often dilute an otherwise excellent experience. For instance, thumping synth, acrobatic platforming, and swordplay that will put your reflexes to the test sound like a winning combination in my book, and Ghostrunner delivers on all three. And in hindsight, if it had stopped there, the game might have been one of my favorites of this year. However, slower puzzle-based sections and a forgettable story take the focus away from what it does well, and while they don't ruin the game, they wind up feeling unnecessary and distracting. Its action focus is easily where Ghostrunner excels, putting you in control of a genetically enhanced super ninja who uses extreme speed and agility to survive in an industrial cyberpunk dystopia. What this means in terms of gameplay is that you'll be put up against platforming gauntlets and open combat arenas with multiple paths winding through them, and an onslaught of enemies who can take you out with one hit. To balance things out, you have a range of mobility options at your disposal, as well as a handful of special attacks and a standard katana strike that also takes enemies out in a single slice. Your greatest tool for survival in Ghostrunner is, without a doubt, the game's wide range of mobility options. You can run, jump, and slide, and early on the game introduces you to simple wall running, which, for the most part, works exactly how you would expect it to. Jump into a wall and hold the stick in that direction, and the Ghostrunner will stick to the wall until you jump off, or the wall ends. It's not long before the game also introduces grapple points, which allow you to zip between them with the press of the left trigger, or zip lines that propel you forward as soon as you grab them. The variety of traversal mechanics allows the game to slowly ramp up the difficulty of platforming sequences by introducing elements gradually before going balls to the wall with everything at once in the later stages of the game. You'll be sliding into grapple points, landing on zip lines, and then jumping into wall runs within the same 20-second period near the tail end of Ghostrunner, and it is incredibly responsive and satisfying. If the game were made entirely of platforming sequences, I would be pretty happy with that, but Ghostrunner doubles down on the adrenaline-pumping action by littering areas with a variety of enemies that can all insta-kill you. While this might sound frustrating at the outset, your aforementioned heightened mobility does give you a bit of a safety net. So long as you're moving around an enemy, their shots are likely to fall behind you, and even if you do move directly towards a shooter, you have a handy air dodge that lets you slow down time and sidestep oncoming shots. Add to that a standard dodge to avoid faster, close-range enemies, and you have a lot of survival tools at your disposal. Now, when it comes to actually returning the violent favor, Ghostrunner is pretty light on options, but it does well with what it provides. First and foremost is the game's katana strike, which kills non-boss enemies in a single direct hit. You can also use it to block incoming bullets with some very precise timing, or reflect those bullets back at enemies if you equip the right upgrades. The game does provide some more in-depth offensive options in the form of metered abilities, but if I'm being honest, the intense pace of the game usually had me forgetting about those entirely. That's not to say that they aren't cool or useful, I just didn't use them as often as the game probably intended me to. Over the course of the game, you're given 4 unique abilities. Blink, which allows you to line up enemies and dispatch them in a single dash attack. Tempest, which serves as a shotgun blast for taking out close-range groups. Surge, which gives you a wide, long-range attack. And Overlord, which allows you to dominate a single enemy and force them to betray their allies. Like I said, all of these abilities have their uses, but more often than not they require a level of finesse or focus that my overloaded brain just could not handle with everything else going on. Tempest is easily the one I found most useful, if only as a get out of trouble button, but the others just need a little bit more time to aim, which feels counterintuitive to the rest of the game's design. The element that really spices up the otherwise bare-bones combat of Ghostrunner are its enemy types. You start the game racing around these levels dodging bullets from a handful of gun-toting hostiles, but as you progress you're introduced to leaping enemies who try to smash you into the ground, katana wielders who you have to parry with your own katana strike at the last second, and shielded enemies that you have to maneuver your way around. Ghostrunner is constantly throwing new and interesting threats at you, even in its final stages, and the way they encourage you to think and move differently, whether that be by surfing attack drones or running away from exploding hostiles, helps to keep this otherwise simple combat experience really engaging. The game also peppers its stages with momentary power-ups in an attempt to keep things interesting, and these are a little hit or miss. Power-ups that augment your movement in interesting ways like the super slow motion and the hyper jump are pretty neat, while the ranged shuriken, which the game uses for time-based puzzles and combat in equal parts, winds up being more annoying than anything. They run into the same issue as the special moves in that they require a bit more finesse than the game's speed comfortably allows for, and the game is at its best when you're not forced to slow down. Unfortunately, Ghostrunner's fast pace does relent from time to time, usually in void space levels where you gain your metered abilities and complete puzzles. Now, I call them puzzles, but for the most part these sections boil down to very light, relatively slow platforming sequences where you have to collect a certain number of keys to progress. The most puzzle-like that these parts of the game get are early on with rotating pipe puzzles, which are functional but not overly interesting. Ultimately, the only thing that these parts of the game provide are a safe place to try out your new abilities at the cost of grinding Ghostrunner's momentum to a halt for far longer than they need to. It's interesting because clearly Ghostrunner knows that its constant forward momentum is a huge part of what makes it great, as demonstrated by how its narrative is predominantly told through characters expositing to you while you play the game. This approach doesn't get in the way of the gameplay, but it's not without some drawbacks. The main one being that I couldn't tell you what the hell the game is about without looking the story up or replaying it and focusing on all that exposition. The game is set in a cyberpunk city contained within a single massive structure known as Dharma Tower and puts you in the role of the last surviving Ghostrunner, the tower's genetically enhanced peacekeepers. Following a coup by one of the city's elites, the Ghostrunner must ascend the tower and put an end to the new regime with the help of a resistance movement and a disembodied AI voice in their head. Ghostrunner's setting and story are pretty generic cyberpunk fare, but as a backdrop for acrobatic, lethal action, it works well enough. It's really hard to comment on the writing itself because, as I said, absolutely none of it sunk in while I was actually playing the game. I suppose that's an indictment of the game's overall reliance on constant exposition, but I guess I'd prefer for the game's story to be forgettable rather than intrusive at the end of the day. Now, the cyberpunk style might get lost a bit in the game's story, but it works much better with regards to Ghostrunner's aesthetic and sound design. The game starts with this grungy industrial aesthetic in the early levels, but this eventually gives way to neon-lit city blocks and not quite sterile lab facilities, and each area feels dark and dangerous in their own unique way. But the game's best quality beyond its high-speed action is the soundtrack. As far as synthwave goes, it doesn't necessarily stand out, but the pulsing bass and atmospheric synth combine with the zen-like flow of the platforming in combat to become almost hypnotic. It becomes effortless to just lose yourself in the game's rhythm. That's not to say that Ghostrunner doesn't have a few rough edges though. At launch, the game suffered from some atrocious screen tearing and framerate drops on PS4, but these have largely been ironed out thanks to post-launch patches. Still, some of the game's animations look a little bit janky if you focus on them for too long, and I did have the game crash on me a couple of times, so it's not quite perfect in terms of performance. At the end of the day though, Ghostrunner is a really fun game so long as you're in motion, and it does offer a handful of reasons to come back once you've finished. In addition to simply improving on your times or death count for each level, the game also features collectibles and skins for your katana, as well as a unique approach to upgrades that encourages replayability. Basically, each upgrade takes the form of a little tetramino that you can fit into a board with limited slots. They improve or alter your special abilities or your basic skills like the dash and deflect, and since there isn't enough space to have everything active at once, it can be fun to replay levels with new loadouts, if that's your thing. I will admit though, I do find myself wishing that the game had a dedicated time trial mode that removed all the story and puzzle elements entirely. The idea of having to sit through those puzzle sections in particular is the only thing stopping me from jumping back into the game right now. With all that said, Ghostrunner is good. With a wide variety of mobility options and a surprising cavalcade of enemies to keep you guessing, Ghostrunner's action-focused gameplay is an absolute winner, and on the quality of that alone, I think it's definitely worth checking out. However, it isn't without its issues, as the game's slower tutorial and puzzle-based segments grind its pace to a frustrating halt. Additionally, if you're looking for a compelling story, I'm not sure you'll find one here, as it winds up being more of a mild distraction than anything. Ghostrunner is currently available on PS4, Xbox One, and PC.